The rain came down like a wall, hammering the windshield so hard Marcus could barely see the road ahead. It was one of those nights where the world seemed bent on testing his patience. The sky was pitch black, the road slick with water, and his wipers were fighting a losing battle. He leaned closer to the steering wheel, squinting through the sheets of rain. The highway stretched endlessly, with no other cars in sight. His headlights bounced off the reflective lines on the asphalt, but they were no help. Every few seconds his truck hit a puddle, sending water spraying up and jolting him in his seat. "Damn storm," Marcus muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. He had been on the road too long already. The shift at the warehouse had dragged, and now all he wanted was to crawl into bed and forget the day existed. His knuckles whitened as he adjusted his grip. He hated driving in the rain. It made him feel trapped, like the night itself was conspiring against him. Then it happened, a blur of movement on the side of the road. Something fast, brown, and low to the ground darted out of the bushes. Marcus reacted on instinct. His foot slammed on the brake, and he yanked the steering wheel to the side hard. The tires screeched as they lost traction on the slick pavement, and the truck skidded violently, swinging around as if it had a mind of its own. The headlights cut through the rain in a disorienting arc, blinding him briefly. The truck spun once, twice. Marcus fought to regain control, but it was useless. Then came the impact. The front end of the truck slammed into a tree with a sickening crunch, the force throwing Marcus forward into the steering wheel. The airbag exploded, hitting him hard, and his head snapped back against the headrest. A searing jolt of pain shot through him, and his world tilted sideways. For a moment, everything went silent except for the rain drumming relentlessly on the metal roof. He tried to move, but a sharp, shooting pain ran through his side, locking him in place. He was pinned by the crushed dashboard, his limbs sluggish and unresponsive. Panic set in, cold and fast. He could hear a hiss, fuel leaking. A metallic groan from the wrecked engine told him the truck wasn't done breaking down. The acrid smell of fumes filled the cabin, sharp enough to sting his nose. He knew what came next. If the fumes ignite. The thought was enough to steal his breath. His heart pounded. The seatbelt dug into his chest, but he couldn't muster the strength to reach for the release. He was stuck, the truck creaking around him like a giant beast ready to give up and collapse entirely. "Come on," Marcus muttered to himself, gasping. "Come on." The world outside blurred. The rain had soaked through the broken windows, chilling his skin. He felt his body growing heavier, slipping into that dangerous place between wakefulness and unconsciousness. He shook his head weakly, fighting to stay awake, but it was no use. The edges of his vision began to close in. Then he heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, closer. Someone was out there, moving toward him through the rain. The driver's door groaned as it was wrenched open, the sound echoing in Marcus's ears like a lifeline. A figure leaned into the truck, silhouetted against the rain-slicked darkness. "Hold on," a voice said, calm, steady, and determined. Marcus blinked, struggling to focus. He saw her briefly, a woman, her dark skin shining under the rain, soaked to the bone. Her hands moved fast, working to free him from the wreck with surprising strength. She smelled of rain and exhaustion, her grip firm but careful as she pulled at the seatbelt tangled around his body. "You're not dying here tonight," she said under her breath, almost like a promise. Marcus tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His head was heavy, swimming with confusion. Who was this woman? Why was she doing this? She didn't wait for questions. With one final pull, she released him from the seatbelt and began dragging him out of the truck. Marcus winced as pain shot through his side, but the woman didn't stop. She pulled him clear of the vehicle just as a low groan came from the wreckage, a warning. Moments later, a burst of fire ignited beneath the hood. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the flames curled upward, licking at the sides of the truck and spreading fast. The heat was intense, even from where they lay on the wet ground. He coughed, struggling for air, his entire body trembling from shock and exhaustion. The woman crouched beside him, her breathing labored but steady. "You're gonna be okay," she whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus blinked, trying to stay conscious, but the world was slipping away from him. The storm raged around them, thunder cracking overhead. The woman's face was the last thing he saw, her sharp eyes focused on him, her soaked hair plastered to her forehead, a look of fierce determination etched into her features. And then everything went dark. Marcus stirred to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the cold touch of a needle pricked at his arm. His chest ached with every shallow breath, and his head throbbed with dull pressure. He blinked against the sterile brightness, trying to piece together the fragments of memory swimming in his mind. The rain, the crash, and her, that woman, the one who saved him. A nurse appeared beside him, adjusting the drip attached to his arm. "Good to see you awake," she said with a practiced smile. Marcus's throat was dry. "What happened?" he managed to ask, his voice raspy. The nurse checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. "You were in a serious car accident. Someone pulled you out before the vehicle caught fire." Marcus tried to sit up, but the nurse gently pressed him back down. "Easy," she said. "You need rest." His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of it all. "The person who saved me," he started, his voice rough. The nurse nodded. "A woman brought you in. Didn't stay long, just dropped you off and left." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Did she say her name?" "No," the nurse replied casually, flipping through his chart. "But she was black. That much I remember." The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. A black woman. He lay back against the pillows, his thoughts spiraling. Why had she saved him? What did she want? And, more importantly, why did the idea of owing his life to her bother him so much? The hospital room felt colder after the nurse left. Marcus lay back, staring at the ceiling, his mind spiraling into uncomfortable places. He had to know more about the woman who saved him, why she would go out of her way to help someone like him, a stranger. But it wasn't just that. Deep down, he knew the truth. If the roles had been reversed, he wasn't sure he'd have done the same for her. That thought gnawed at him, dragging old prejudices he'd buried to the surface. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jake, his brother. Marcus hesitated before answering. He wasn't in the mood for his brother's smug attitude tonight, but ignoring him wasn't an option. "Hey," Marcus muttered, holding the phone to his ear. "You alive, man?" Jake's voice came through, laced with sarcasm. "Heard you got yourself in some trouble." "Yeah," Marcus replied flatly. "Wrecked my truck." Jake chuckled. "Bet you were cussing the rain the whole time. Lucky someone found you." Marcus didn't respond right away. "Yeah, a woman pulled me out." "No way," Jake said, amusement creeping into his voice. "Let me guess. Some good Samaritan?" Marcus hesitated. "She was black." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Jake laughed. "Man, you got saved by one of them? Bet that stings." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, more harshly than intended. Jake chuckled again. "Relax, little brother. Just saying, that's some irony right there." Marcus ended the call without another word, tossing the phone back onto the nightstand. His brother's words echoed in his mind, stirring something ugly and familiar, something Marcus wasn't ready to confront yet. The next day, Marcus was discharged from the hospital with a few bruised ribs and a lingering headache. But that wasn't what weighed on him. The woman haunted his thoughts. He needed to see her again, not just to say thank you, but to understand. After some digging, he tracked down a lead. The nurse had mentioned the diner she worked at, and Marcus knew the area well enough. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, tucked-away joint on the outskirts of town. When he pulled into the parking lot, the neon sign above the entrance flickered faintly. Dixie's Diner. The lot was nearly empty, just a few old cars scattered here and there. Marcus hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. "What the hell am I even doing here?" he thought. But the need to know outweighed the awkwardness. He killed the engine and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The smell of bacon grease and stale coffee greeted him, along with the low hum of a radio playing in the background. A few patrons sat at scattered tables, but Marcus's eyes locked on the woman behind the counter. It was her. She was wiping down the countertop with a dishcloth, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had the night of the crash. Her dark curls were pulled back under a worn baseball cap, and her expression was calm, indifferent, like she didn't have a care in the world. Marcus approached the counter slowly, unsure of what to say. He cleared his throat. "You're the one who pulled me from the truck," he said awkwardly. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no spark of recognition, no grand reaction. She just gave a small nod. "Yeah, that was me," she replied simply. "You doing okay now?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by her nonchalance. "Yeah, thanks, I guess." She smiled, but it was more out of politeness than warmth. "No need to guess, just glad you made it." Marcus hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Why'd you do it?" he asked finally. "Why help me?" The woman shrugged. "You were in trouble, that's all that mattered." Her answer was so simple, so matter-of-fact, it left Marcus speechless. He'd expected something more, an explanation, maybe a lecture, but not this. "What's your name?" he asked, desperate to fill the silence. "Ava," she replied, wiping her hands on the dishcloth. Marcus nodded, feeling foolish. "Well, thanks, Ava. I mean it." Ava gave him a small, patient smile. "Take care of yourself, okay?" She turned back to her work, leaving Marcus standing at the counter, more unsettled than before. Marcus left the diner, but the conversation with Ava lingered in his mind. Her calm demeanor, the way she acted like saving his life was no big deal. It all bothered him in ways he couldn't explain. As he drove home, memories of the crash flashed in his mind. The way she had pulled him from the wreck without hesitation. The way she had shielded him from the flames. And now, she acted like it was just another ordinary day. It didn't sit right with him. Back in his apartment, Marcus paced the living room, replaying their encounter over and over. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ava than she let on, that her kindness carried a weight he didn't understand. And then there was the other question, the one that gnawed at him most. If the roles had been reversed, would he have done the same for her? The answer came quickly and hit hard. No, he wouldn't have. That truth sat heavy in his chest, making it hard to breathe. It was an ugly realization, one that exposed parts of himself he didn't want to face. He collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so much of his life avoiding people like Ava, people he thought didn't belong in his world. And now, one of them had saved his life without asking for anything in return. It made him feel small. It made him feel ashamed. The next day, Marcus found himself back at the diner. He didn't know why, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, but he needed to see her again. This time, Ava greeted him with the same polite indifference, sliding a menu across the counter. Marcus ordered coffee, and for a while they sat in silence, the hum of the radio filling the space between them. "So, you always make a habit of saving strangers?" Marcus asked, attempting a joke. Ava gave a small laugh. "Not exactly. You just got lucky, I guess." Marcus sipped his coffee, feeling a strange sense of peace in her presence. He didn't understand it, but sitting here talking to her made the world feel a little less heavy. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was starting to change. Marcus's third visit to the diner felt different. This time, it wasn't just curiosity dragging him back. It was something heavier. Guilt. Every moment he spent with Ava chipped away at the wall he had built over the years, and he didn't know how to stop it. His old beliefs clung stubbornly to him, but they were starting to feel wrong. It was like peeling away layers of a mask he had worn for so long, only to realize he no longer recognized the face beneath it. The bell above the diner door jingled as Marcus walked in, nodding awkwardly toward Ava. She gave him the same polite smile as usual, but today there was a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. Marcus slid onto a stool at the counter. "Rough day?" Ava chuckled softly, though it didn't carry any joy. Just the usual. Marcus opened his mouth to ask more, but the words caught in his throat as a familiar voice boomed from behind him. "Marcus? That you?" He turned to see Doug, an old drinking buddy standing near the entrance with a sneer plastered across his face. Doug was the kind of guy Marcus used to hang out with. A loudmouth, always ready to stir trouble, never thinking twice before throwing around a slur or two. Marcus felt his stomach twist. "What the hell are you doing in a place like this?" Doug asked, walking over. His gaze flicked between Marcus and Ava, and a smug grin spread across his face. "Didn't think you were the kind to hang out with people like her." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Doug, you don't want to start this." But Doug didn't stop. "What, you friends with her now? What's next? Holding hands at protests?" Ava said nothing, calmly continuing her work, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. Doug laughed, but Marcus didn't find it funny. He stood up slowly, his fists clenched. "Leave." Doug blinked, his grin faltering. "Come on, man. Don't tell me you're going soft." Marcus took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I said leave." Doug stared at him for a moment, searching for the old Marcus, the one who would have laughed along with him. But that Marcus was gone. With a shrug, Doug muttered, "Your loss," and sauntered out the door, leaving Marcus standing there, the weight of his choices settling heavily on his chest. When he turned back to the counter, Ava met his gaze with something close to approval, though it was guarded. "Guess you're not who I thought you were." Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Guess not." After Doug left, Marcus sat back down at the counter, the awkward tension between him and Ava slowly easing. He wanted to apologize, for Doug, for himself, for everything, but the words felt clumsy in his mouth. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry about him." Ava gave a small shrug as if to say she was used to it. "You don't need to apologize for other people." But Marcus felt like he did. He needed to apologize for the man he had been, for the things he'd thought and said over the years, and yet, Ava's calm acceptance made it harder. She wasn't angry, she wasn't trying to change him, she was just there. That was the hardest part. Marcus kept returning to the diner, slowly building a strange kind of friendship with Ava. It wasn't easy. Every conversation was a reminder of the world he had tried so hard to ignore. But something about Ava's honesty kept pulling him back. She didn't lecture him or demand apologies. She just told her story. Her brother, Elijah, killed by police. The protests, the pain, the endless fight for justice that never seemed to end. Marcus listened, really listened, for the first time in his life. And with every story Ava shared, something inside him shifted. One night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through old news articles about Elijah's death. He remembered seeing the headlines back then. He remembered dismissing it, thinking it was just another tragic incident blown out of proportion. But now, with Ava's voice in his head, he saw the truth he had refused to see before. Elijah wasn't just a statistic. He was Ava's brother, a son, a friend. The guilt settled deep in Marcus's chest, and for the first time, he let himself feel it. The next morning, Marcus joined Ava at a community event, a memorial for Elijah and others lost to police violence. He wasn't sure why he went. Maybe he just wanted to support Ava. Maybe he wanted to prove to himself that he could change. The gathering was small but powerful, filled with quiet speeches and shared grief. Marcus stood in the back, listening as Ava spoke about her brother with a strength that left him breathless. He realized then that change wasn't about saying the right things. It was about being present, even when it was uncomfortable. And for the first time, Marcus felt like he belonged. But the more Marcus changed, the more pushback he received from the people in his old life. Jake called again, this time angrier. "What the hell are you doing, Marcus? You think hanging around those people makes you one of them?" Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of his brother's words settling heavily. But when he opened them, the answer was clear. "I'm not who I used to be, Jake." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then the call ended. Marcus stared at the phone, knowing he had just burned one of the last bridges to his old life, and for once he was okay with that. When Ava's landlord served her an eviction notice, Marcus jumped into action without hesitation. He attended meetings, filed complaints, and spoke at community rallies, doing everything in his power to fight the injustice. It wasn't easy. But Marcus didn't back down. He was done standing on the sidelines. The fight against Ava's eviction made headlines, and soon the media picked up their story, how a black woman had saved a man with a history of prejudice, and how that man was now standing beside her. Marcus watched the news coverage in disbelief. The world saw him as a symbol of redemption, but all he saw was a man trying to be better. Months passed, and Marcus and Ava's friendship deepened. They fought together, laughed together, and built something neither of them had expected, a bond rooted in respect and trust. And as Marcus stood beside Ava at a community event, looking out at the people they had inspired, he knew that this was only the beginning. He wasn't the same man he had been, and for the first time in his life, he was proud of who he had become. Ava's eviction battle wasn't just about saving her home. It was about standing up to a system that had failed her and her community too many times. And Marcus was right there with her, attending every meeting and rally, pushing back against the corrupt policies targeting people like Ava. The more Marcus immersed himself in Ava's world, the more he saw the cracks in his old beliefs. He no longer felt like an outsider at these protests. Every chant, every speech, every sign carried meaning now. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving it to himself. Despite their efforts, the eviction case dragged on. Local officials weren't willing to back down easily. But Ava refused to give up, and neither did Marcus. He saw how tirelessly she fought, fueled by a quiet but unrelenting fire. Watching her, Marcus realized what real strength looked like. The day of the final eviction hearing arrived, and the courthouse was packed. Marcus sat beside Ava in the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The lawyer, representing the landlord, droned on about zoning violations and overdue rent, but Marcus could see the truth beneath the words. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. Ava sat calmly through it all, her face unreadable. Marcus envied her composure. If it were up to him, he would have torn into the lawyer, but Ava knew better. She understood that anger, no matter how justified, could be used against her. When the judge finally announced the ruling, Marcus held his breath. "The eviction notice is overturned," the judge said. "The tenant may remain in the property." A wave of relief washed over Marcus, but Ava's reaction was subtle, a small, tired smile, as if she had expected nothing less. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus as they left the courtroom, "for standing with me." And, for the first time, Marcus knew what it felt like to fight for something that truly mattered. Within days of the court victory, their story hit the news. Reporters latched onto the narrative. A black woman saves the life of a man with a history of prejudice, and he now fights by her side. Headlines painted Marcus as a man redeemed, and Ava as a hero of resilience. Their photo, standing shoulder to shoulder at a protest, circulated on social media, sparking debates about forgiveness, change, and justice. At first, Marcus felt overwhelmed by the attention. He had never intended to become a public figure, but Ava, as always, took it in stride. "They're just telling a story," she said one day as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset. "It doesn't change the work we still have to do." Marcus nodded, knowing she was right. The media attention would fade, but the fight would continue. Not everyone was happy about Marcus's transformation. Old friends distanced themselves, and Jake, his brother, grew increasingly hostile. "You're a damn fool, Marcus," Jake said during their last phone call. "You think these people will ever really accept you?" "They already have," Marcus replied, his voice steady. Jake scoffed. "You'll see. You're nothing to them. Just a prop for their little redemption story." Marcus ended the call without saying goodbye. He knew Jake was wrong, but the words still stung. Changing wasn't easy. It meant losing people along the way. But, for the first time, Marcus was okay with that. As Ava's advocacy work gained traction, the backlash began. She started receiving anonymous threats, letters slipped under her door, cruel messages sent to her phone. Marcus felt his anger rise again, but Ava remained calm. "This isn't new," she said. "I've dealt with it before." But Marcus wasn't willing to let it slide. He insisted on installing security cameras around her house and accompanied her to every public event. He wouldn't let her face this alone. The threats only made Marcus more determined. He knew what they were fighting for was bigger than the two of them, and he wasn't going to let fear stop them. Ava's influence grew beyond their community. She was invited to speak at conferences and events across the state, sharing her story and advocating for housing reform and police accountability. Marcus attended every event, standing quietly in the background as Ava took the stage. He didn't need the spotlight, he just needed to know he was doing the right thing. At one event, a reporter approached Marcus with a microphone. "What made you change?" she asked. Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "I met someone worth changing for." It was the simplest truth he knew. Months passed, and Marcus found himself settling into this new version of his life. He didn't just support Ava, he actively participated in the movement, organizing events, speaking at rallies, and mentoring young activists. Every day was a challenge, but it felt right. He was no longer weighed down by the guilt of his past. He was building something new. One evening, as they sat together after a long day of meetings, Ava leaned back and smiled. "You've come a long way, Marcus." He smiled back. "Couldn't have done it without you." Ava chuckled. "You did the work yourself. I just gave you a push." The final twist in their journey came unexpectedly. One day, Ava received a call from a national news outlet. They wanted to feature her in a documentary about community leaders affecting change. Ava hesitated at first, unsure whether the attention would help or hurt their cause, but Marcus encouraged her. "You've earned this," he said. "People need to hear your story." The documentary aired a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country, and donations flooded into Ava's community initiative. Marcus watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He knew this wasn't the end of their journey, it was just the beginning. Years later, Marcus and Ava stood together at the opening of a new community center, built with the funds raised from Ava's advocacy work. The crowd cheered as they cut the ribbon, and Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't the man he used to be. He had changed, truly changed, and there was no going back. As they stood together, watching children run through the new playground, Ava leaned over and whispered, "We did well, Marcus." He nodded, feeling the weight of those words. They had fought, they had lost, they had won, and through it all, they had found something worth holding on to. Their story wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and filled with setbacks. But it was real, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Marcus and Ava knew the fight for justice was far from over, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had each other, and they had hope. Thanks for watching. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit the like button and unsubscribe for more powerful narratives that spark change. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that transformation is possible, no matter where you start. Drop a comment below. What's one step you think people can take today to build a more just and empathetic world? Let's keep the conversation going. Make sure to turn on the key notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And if you want to dive deeper, check out the videos we've linked for more inspiring content. Together, we can build a community that believes in the power of change. Stay hopeful, stay engaged, and we'll see you in the next one.